A World Without Police, I think for me was a long time coming. I've been doing anti-police organizing for about 15 years, starting in particular with the murder of Oscar Grant in Oakland, California. But at the same time that I was sort of, organizing around police murder and abolitionist struggles on the ground in Oakland, I was doing work on revolutionary movements in Venezuela, for example, and moving back and forth between Oakland and Caracas, and realizing that people were really struggling for a lot of the same things. That communities that had risen up against the police in Venezuela and driven the police out, taken over, community power and the ability to govern themselves, were also, these were also demands of the Black Panther Party, for example, in Oakland, California. And so, over the past 15 years, in what we've thankfully seen as an escalating cycle of struggle against police brutality and against the existence of the police, from Ferguson to Baltimore and then to Minneapolis as a really unprecedented wave of militant rebellions in the streets. We've seen, a higher level of, consciousness when it comes to not only what it is that the police do, their essential functions, but also the possibility and indeed the imperative to think of alternatives, develop those alternatives, and to abolish and dismantle policing. We are lucky enough to be blessed with an absolute wealth of abolitionist literature and to be surrounded by abolitionist scholars and organizers like Mariam Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela Davis, Robin D.G. Kelly, all people that I think helped to inspire this work. And if I said this book was a long time coming, at the same time, this particular book, I think, was the product of its moment, was the product of its time, and could really only have been written in the heat of the George Floyd rebellion. And I think the task of all, all revolutionary literature and organizing texts is to intervene in that moment and to attempt to extend toward the future insofar as is possible. And luckily, we're in a moment where we're taking abolition seriously. So some of the questions are, well, what does abolition actually look like? We're talking about presence versus absence. We're talking about creating and imagining new institutions in the way that this is a task of the present, as it was a task, for the abolition of slavery 150 years ago. But what does that look like today? And some of the difficult questions that I wanted to raise. What does abolition have to do with, for example, global imperialism, understanding the police as a global force that is, fundamentally, tied to U.S. empire, and what it would look like to envision abolition on a global scale as uniting all of these struggles. Some of the difficulties around what does community mean? What does community self-defense mean? Because the long trajectory of, Black struggle, brown struggle in the United States and beyond has been about community self-defense, and taking that seriously, I think, is one of the tasks of this book. And finally, I think the question of binding abolition of the police to abolition of ICE, of Border Patrol, the abolition of the border, is one of the key interventions that I want to make in this book, because the police were synonymous with the expansion of the border. They helped to expand that border. They engaged in genocide of indigenous people. They stole northern Mexico. They dispossessed the people that remained living there and handed their land over to white people. This has been the function of the police from the beginning. The police are not workers, although they like to act like workers when it suits them. They're more like fraternities on college campuses. In other words, violent brotherhoods that seek privilege and that try to, have total impunity for all of their actions. The police, from the very beginning have not been like workers. They've not developed alongside workers. Even if they call themselves unions, what they've done is to leverage their privileged position within the white supremacist power structure for benefits, for greater impunity, for higher wages. At the same time that union wages are dropping, collapsing, police wages have gone up. Why? Because they turn around and say, we are the last line of defense. When the shit hits the fan, we are the ones who need to save the city, the city power structure. They are the white supremacist glue that holds together American capitalism. And so it's essential that we understand that they are not workers. And it's essential that we start the process, which is already underway in many labor federations, to throw them out of the unions, to kick them out, to abolish their organizations. If people knew what police unions do on a daily basis, they would be absolutely scandalized. They negotiate binding agreements with city officials at the point of a gun, essentially, demanding greater, salary increases, demanding total impunity, and in making it almost impossible for abusive cops to be held responsible. On the state level, they push through special rights for police as a special class of citizens called what are called law enforcement officer bills of rights that give them extra privileges on the state level. And on top of all that, on the national level, the police, along with the ICE unions, along with the Border Patrol unions, were not only members of the Trump coalition, adamant supporters of Trump, but they were on the far right wing of the Trump, coalition. They were trying to drive Trump further to the right by making demands that can only be described as fascistic. The vision of these police unions is one of total impunity, and it's a direct affront to even what limited democracy we enjoy in the United States. Labor unions and federations are hesitant to throw out anyone who wants to unionize, right? And this is on some level understandable. But the existence of police unions, so-called unions within labor federations, is an absolute insult to the rest of those unions, which are not only poor people and working people, they are largely workers of color, and they are those who are precisely targeted every day by the police. You don't have other workers demanding and bargaining for the right to kill workers with impunity. And this is exactly what the police do every day. Whereas other public sector workers show solidarity and show their support for other workers, police are always trying to protect their own privileges. They show no solidarity, and yet they expect solidarity. When it comes to being within a workers' federation, they should be immediately thrown out. They need to be, dismantled, and we need to have an argument and a debate within the labor movement about the fact that the true vision in the future of labor in the United States and globally is a transnational vision, is a multiracial vision. The vast majority of the working class are those who are targeted by the police every day. And so it's a much better bet to bet on that vast majority rather than this small, privileged, violent sector of so-called police unions. The real danger of all neighborhood watch programs is that they either become the police themselves or they simply operate as adjuncts to the police. That is not the vision that we are trying to build. But what are the ingredients of that, of that situation? Precisely the fact that the society is an unequal one. If you abolish the police tomorrow, you would have plenty of neighborhood watches. You would have private police, and you would have a society that looks very much like the society that we live in until we go engage in the fundamental process of transforming and eliminating those hierarchies. We're going to see much of the same. When it comes to the question of vigilantism, the first thing to recognize is that the police have always been engaged in vigilante violence. The line between the police and the Klan is a thin one indeed. Organizations like the Texas Rangers have been at the intersection of that historically, and police were happy to look on while lynchings happened, in the U.S. South, historically speaking. The police have never stopped or prevented vigilante violence. When we talk about Ahmaud Arbery as someone who was effectively lynched by, white, citizens, he was also being policed. That's what they were doing. They were the same as the police when they followed him, tracked him, surrounded him, and ultimately murdered him. And so the question is not so much, is vigilantism good or bad? It's why do we let white supremacy operate outside of the state and outside of the police? And why do we refuse to take that power into our own hands? Of course, the organizations that we need to build in communities need to be democratic organizations. They need to be egalitarian organizations. They need to be organizations that don't simply uphold the inequalities of our society, racial inequalities, economic inequalities, but seek to view everyone as valuable members of that community and build a real vision of community safety that doesn't reproduce those inequalities. You saw a lot of that during the George Floyd rebellion in Minneapolis, when some people did want to protect their property, or they wanted to protect their community centers, or they wanted to protect schools, but they did so in a way that didn't reproduce the logic of the police, and certainly didn't hand people over to the police. That's the kind of community defense and community organizing that we need to deepen. And we need to build that fabric upward as a broader alternative to this world of police that's been developing for hundreds of years now. Multiracial policing is nothing new. In W.E.B. Du Bois, 130 years ago, was talking about the presence of Black police in the city of Philadelphia. And fast forward 100 years, and a Black city administration is dropping a bomb on a Black neighborhood and destroying it and burning down a city block. This has never been a solution to the problem. And yet what you find in every police reform proposal is the question of diversifying the police. We know statistically, we know without a shred of doubt that diversifying police, that having officers of color, having women does not change the way the police behave because they're sent out every day to perform a function. Whether or not whether or not they're black or brown or, men or women, they still perform the same function, which is to uphold property and whiteness at the same time. And there are even studies that have shown that women and officers of color are more likely to be violent, precisely because they need to prove themselves doing the job that they've signed up for. Diversifying police doesn't change anything, just as we've seen diversifying city administrations doesn't necessarily change how policing operates. It still operates in the service of white supremacy. It still operates in the service of wealth. And without dismantling those structures and transforming society and pushing back on the role that police have in society, there's no way that we can really get at these fundamental questions. The equation of whiteness and the police is one that, goes back to the very beginning. It was with the failure of Reconstruction. It was with the destruction of the attempt to build an egalitarian society by white supremacist violence and terror, by the Klan, that we have the beginning of the police. And what were those police? It was white people deputized to patrol slaves, deputized to fight back against black-led democracy. That was the origin of the police. In other words, it was never different from whiteness. And as Du Bois once put it, the entire South was an armed camp for terrorizing black people. And when you see many situations that occur today, we see that very little has changed, on that level. As to what we do about it, I think if we understand the old race trader slogan, in other words, treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. If we understand that as a collective concept, then I think we can start to think about what it would mean for poor white Southerners, as Du Bois argued, to join with poor black Southerners in a class effort to abolish white supremacy and to, in the process, strike a massive blow against U.S. capitalism and the domination of the rich. That's still the project for today. What happens is that not only is it the case that whiteness and white supremacy is the fundamental barrier to revolutionary class struggle, but the police are the fundamental mechanism that upholds that color line every day. And so by striking at the police, we do something much bigger, which is to strike at white supremacy, and by that to strike a blow at the heart of U.S. capitalism as well. One of the main things today is that we are being told that we need to forget about what happened last summer. The entire system of the media and the political apparatus is trying to get us to forget the fact that last summer everything seemed possible. Change was on the table, and not only was it on the table, it was necessary. It was absolutely imperative because of the force that had been brought into the streets. The entire political governing apparatus wants us to forget that possibility, but we need to keep that possibility alive. And outside of the many inspiring moments that happened in Portland and Minneapolis and other parts of the world, even because this was a global revolt. I just remember being in Philadelphia, and really, as someone who's been living here for more than 10 years and doing anti-police organizing and seeing the ebbs and flows of it, and the sort of the moments where you call people out to the street and it doesn't show up, or then when the Baltimore rebellion is going on, we call people out to the streets and thousands of people would show up. I've never seen anything like what happened last summer. Thousands of people showed up. They marched, they were angry, they were directly targeting the police. 6 police vehicles were burned in and around City Hall. The entirety of downtown was taken over. People were looting, and by that I mean they were taking things that they wanted and things that they needed. They were taking things that they needed to survive, and they were taking things that had been so systematically deprived of them, from them as luxuries. And it was really an incredibly beautiful moment of togetherness and of safety. And on that night, I can say perfectly, with 100% certainty that the only really dangerous ones were the police. And the reality is that that's so often the case, that we need to really be able to think about these moments of rebellion and resistance as in some ways a microcosm of what living together looks like, of getting on together. And so when you look at those images of the 3rd precinct being burned, you see a multiracial group of young people celebrating a victory, celebrating a blow, directed at the heart of U.S. white supremacy. And you see that in the fact that 54% of Americans thought that it was entirely legitimate to burn down that precinct. We're in a moment of retrenchment in which, again, the entire political apparatus is trying to get us to chasten our demands for radical democracy, for the abolition of white supremacy and the police. Minneapolis is still trying to dismantle the police department. It will be on the ballot. We need to make sure that if that ballot initiative passes, that what replaces those police is not simply another form of policing. We need to build in our communities, build a fabric of abolitionist, support for one another. That means we don't need to call the police. That means we don't need to invite them into our communities and to bring violence. And it means that we will be able to build, our struggles in conjunction with one another. They're going to be telling us, and they already are telling us, that crime rates are rising, that violence is increasing, and that as a result of that, we need more police. But we know that we don't need to try the same failed solutions that have never worked. We need to build something different. Policing does not reduce violence. It does not contribute to public safety. And if we took those millions, indeed billions of dollars, and dedicated it to really trying to build an egalitarian community, then we wouldn't need the police. If you live in a society where people have what they need to survive, where they have a roof over their heads, where they have food to eat, then why on earth would you need the police? If you live in a society without racial fear, without patriarchal structures of violence and authority, then why would you need the police at all? The question is, how do we tear down the police at the same time that we build up that kind of society? How do we defund the police and redirect those funds in a way that builds up a social fabric so we can point to those accomplishments and say, look, that is abolition in practice and we need more of it?